This week, the Supreme Court didn't just issue a ruling. They performed what really amounts to a fundamental, almost surgical intervention into the executive branch. It's, frankly, the most severe judicial check on presidential authority that we've seen in decades. And crucially, this was a 7-2 vote.
Right. And that intervention, that surgery, as you call it, it feels more like surgery without anesthesia. They've effectively crippled the executive branch overnight.
Well, we are talking about this seismic ruling, right? It invalidated over 30 executive orders. It aggressively shut down these really expansive claims of, quote, total authority. So the central question, I think, isn't purely about the legality, which, let's be honest, seemed clearly violated, but about the functional outcome. Did the court execute a necessary, maybe even historic, defense of the separation of powers?
Okay. I see why you'd emphasize the principle. I do. But my focus has to be on the devastation left behind. Did the court just swap one kind of overreach, unchecked executive power for, frankly, another? Which is this total administrative paralysis that pretty much guarantees a functionally dysfunctional government for what, the next 2 years? I'm arguing the immediate chaos, that's the greater threat right now.
And I'll be arguing that this was absolutely a critical, stabilizing check on presidential overreach, a necessary, defining moment that, prevents the presidency from collapsing into something like an elected dictatorship. Let's maybe start with the math here, because the numbers themselves, they're like a constitutional firewall in this case. The 7-2 margin, that includes 3 justices appointed by the very administration being checked, right? Barrett, Kavanaugh, Gorsuch. That alone confirms the overreach was just so extreme, it became legally indefensible. The court established clear, bright lines. Presidents simply cannot claim unilateral, boundless power over independent agencies. Think like the FTC, the SEC. This was the judiciary doing its constitutional job, period.
Okay, you call that stabilization. I look at it and I call it administrative paralysis. Seriously, just imagine being a mid-level manager, maybe in the DOJ this morning. You're trying to process a critical budget transfer or maybe a specific federal layoff that was planned, and now the legal basis for that action, some specific executive order, it's just gone, revoked instantly. Policies that have been running for months are suddenly unwound, forcing agencies back to structures that are frankly obsolete. You've essentially sacrificed the ability of the executive branch to function day to day for the sake of what? Legal purity?
But that administrative distress you're describing, isn't that the direct, unavoidable consequence of the administration relying on illegal structures in the first place? Chief Justice Roberts' warning, it really underscores the necessity here. He talked about unchecked authority striking at the marrow of the republic itself. That level of judicial concern, from the Chief Justice no less, it demanded immediate action. What was the alternative? To just normalize executive lawlessness?
Normalizing lawlessness is bad. Yes, I absolutely agree. But forcing an immediate, completely unsustainable restructuring right in the middle of let's face it, a political crisis, is that really better? The sheer volume of these invalidations, over 30 orders hitting all at once, has created massive institutional uncertainty. This chaos cripples the administration's ability to govern effectively, even on stuff that's not partisan, basic functions.
But that chaos is simply the sound an illegal structure makes when it collapses. Let's look at the actual mechanism of the overreach itself. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, remember, a Trump appointee, was absolutely unequivocal in her concurrence. She wrote, and I quote, "No president may nullify Congress by decree."
Okay, but what does that mean practically, on the ground?
Practically, it means the administration wasn't just, issuing policy directives. They were actively bypassing specific statutory language, using these vague claims of inherent Article II powers to do things like transfer personnel, freeze budgets, all without Congress's okay. For instance, those specific executive orders on federal layoffs. They were clearly designed to get around civil service protections that Congress wrote into law, and the court said emphatically, nope, you cannot do that.
I hear the principle. Separation of powers, checks and balances. I get it. But principle doesn't process immigration applications, does it? It doesn't maintain federal infrastructure. When a court instantly forces every single agency to revert back to these old pre-order structures, by the way, that were bypassed precisely because they were seen as too slow or just insufficient, you inevitably create operational gridlock. Doesn't functionality have to be part of the legal calculation somehow? Otherwise, the law just becomes an engine of dysfunction itself.
Functionality must exist within the law. That's the point. The problem isn't the court's ruling. The problem is that the president built, well, an entire administrative apparatus based on claiming authority he just didn't legally have. This ruling simply forces the executive branch to finally adhere to the constitutional process, which means working with Congress, something, let's be honest, this administration has been notoriously terrible at.
And you know Congress is dysfunctional. That's the reality we're living in. So you're forcing an administration that has, as you just conceded, zero ability to work within constraints to suddenly become masters of negotiation overnight. And what happens if they fail? The country suffers. That seems to be the trade-off you're accepting.
The country suffers far more when the president asserts total authority. That is the existential danger. The court didn't break the government. They broke the unconstitutional shortcuts the administration was relying on to govern without constraint.
Okay, let's talk about the political cost of this correction then, because legal experts are already immediately comparing this ruling to United States v. Nixon back in '74.
And they should. It's arguably the biggest judicial check in 50 years. It addresses the fundamental scope of presidential power, not just for this president, but for all future presidents.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the parallel is entirely positive here. While Nixon dealt with specific criminal conduct, the Watergate tapes, this ruling is so incredibly broad, it feels like a constitutional ambush. It effectively grants every political opponent maximum leverage. This ruling isn't just a check, it's practically a pre-authorization for political warfare.
Hold on, accountability is not warfare. If the executive branch acted illegally, then investigations must follow. You seem to be arguing that we should tolerate illegal actions just to maintain some kind of administrative comfort level. Is that really the position?
That's a compelling framing, but have you considered the human cost of that so-called accountability, that political warfare? The court's condemnation, it now directly targets high-level figures, people like the former acting deputy AG Patel, the FBI director Bond, the very operatives who executed those now illegal orders. They are absolutely facing political targeting now under the guise of accountability.
But those individuals relied on an unconstitutional premise. They were operating outside the established legal framework.
Yes, okay, legally, maybe. But the practical result is going to be a wave of endless congressional investigations, legal challenges piling up. You'll have defense attorneys arguing, quite credibly I might add, that prosecutions related to this were based on illegally asserted authority. You've essentially invited massive, cascading institutional instability precisely when the public needs law enforcement and the government to be stable. Where is the functional executive leadership supposed to come from now?
The leadership is now forced to be lawful leadership. Look, intellectual disagreement, it sharpens our understanding, right? This ruling is necessarily sweeping because it aims to prevent the expansion of, authoritarian tendencies across the entire political spectrum for generations to come. That is stability, the long-term kind.
But long-term stability might become irrelevant if the short-term chaos leads to a complete government functional freeze. Let's just look at one of the most specific and maybe most dangerous claims of overreach that got struck down, the military aspect. The attempt to federalize state National Guard units for domestic law enforcement, for immigration.
Which is a flagrant violation of the Posse Comitatus Act, a law specifically passed after the Civil War precisely to prevent presidents from using the military like a domestic police force. The court shut down that entire dangerous framework decisively and correctly.
I agree that assertion of authority was incredibly dangerous, yes. But the emergency order that halted those deployments has created a massive vacuum in areas where the federal government had previously committed resources that local agencies, Border Patrol, whoever, they relied upon for critical operations. You can't just pull all those resources overnight and expect everything to just keep running smoothly. That is administrative paralysis in action right there.
So they must find resources that are legally authorized,
It means they have to work with the states, they have to work with Congress to define the proper uses of personnel and funding. You're basically complaining that the president is being forced to use the legally prescribed method, the constitutional method, instead of the illegal shortcut.
But the shortcut was taken because the legally prescribed method is broken, or at least incredibly difficult. The White House is now facing utter chaos and administrative paralysis. The court has, yes, taken away the administration's ability to just bulldoze through obstacles as they liked to do. But the underlying need to govern, to actually address immigration, to manage federal budgets, that need remains completely unmet.
The failure lies squarely with the executive's overreach, not with the judicial correction. The court acted as the necessary backstop. The magnitude of the crisis, the sheer breadth of the overreach. It demanded a definitive, high-consensus rejection like the 7-2 vote.
But the impact, it extends far beyond just the Oval Office, doesn't it? We are now talking about political opponents being handed the biggest hammer they've had in decades. It basically ensures that the last 2 years of this administration will be consumed entirely by investigation, than by actually governing the country.
And if the previous 2 years were consumed by unconstitutional overreach, then perhaps the remaining 2 years should be consumed by the difficult, messy process of bringing the executive branch back into line. This is the process of constitutional correction. And it's not just about this president. The court is defining boundaries for future administrations, too, Democrat or Republican.
But the immediate reality for the people working in government is that the administrative state feels like it's collapsing. If you are a federal employee right now, you genuinely might not know who is authorized to hire you, fire you, or even set your department's budget this afternoon. That confusion isn't just, bureaucratic red tape. That is deep institutional vulnerability, arguably forced by an overzealous pursuit of legal clarity.
That clarity was absolutely necessary because the president was operating on a theory that his power was essentially boundless. Chief Justice Roberts made it crystal clear. The Constitution doesn't establish an all-powerful presidency. It creates a limited executive. And limiting that executive, especially with a 7-2 vote, including his own appointees, sends an unmistakable message to every future president. Stay in your lane.
Okay, but by limiting that executive so severely and so instantaneously, hasn't the court effectively made the executive ineffective, at least for now? It feels like you can't tell a person they need to fight a raging fire, but then take away their, maybe illegally acquired, but only available, hose and truck, and then tell them to go negotiate for new equipment with the hostile city council while the building burns down.
See, I think that comparison falls short. You don't just take away the illegal hose. You tell them they have to use the legally authorized hose in truck that are available through proper channels. And if they refuse or if they fail because they never learned how to use the legal tools, they are the problem, not the rule of law. This ruling fundamentally prevents the creep of authoritarian tendencies across the entire political spectrum for generations. That ultimately is the victory here.
That victory might feel pretty hollow if the government literally ceases to function effectively in the meantime. When did survival, basic operational survival, become optional for the sake of an abstract principle, however important?
Look, this ruling is a critical, possibly historic turning point. It establishes bright-line rules. It ensures no future president, regardless of party, can credibly claim total authority or think they can just nullify Congress by decree. It protects the long-term health of American democracy by forcing the executive, kicking and screaming maybe, but forcing it to operate within the law. And that, I believe, is worth the administrative cost, however high it feels right now.
And I acknowledge the long-term constitutional value, I really do. But the immediate fact remains that the White House and by extension the entire federal government is facing operational gridlock. The court has certainly checked executive overreach, yes, but in doing so, it has arguably created a political and legal firestorm that is going to hamstring essential governance functions and invite just endless legal challenges and investigations for the foreseeable future. The price of this constitutional clarity seems to be immediate and potentially severe dysfunction.
The Supreme Court has definitely drawn a hard line. The question left hanging is,
What are the real-world trade-offs for the stability and the functionality of American governance right now?
So you've heard both sides. Now it's your turn. Drop your take below. Is the constitutional principle worth the immediate cost of administrative paralysis, or should the court have weighed functional efficacy more heavily in its decision? Let us know because we read every comment.